Hello and welcome back. Now, this is a fairly short podcast, but on a topic of competition, which the examiner finds relatively juicy out of this chapter on regulation of businesses. So, why do we want to regulate competition? Well, it's important in a free market economy to have competition, and it's important for these three reasons. Competition helps to allocate resources efficiently. It encourages innovation and efficiency because companies have to compete with each other. Therefore, they're constantly trying to do something better than their competitors can. Therefore, they're looking for new processes. They're looking to do things more cheaply, maybe to use resources more efficiently. They're developing all the time. And as a result of that, the consumer has a lot more choice, both in the range of products available to him, in where he wants to buy them from, and whether he wants to pay more maybe for perhaps an environmental product or not. Monopolies, conversely, tend not to be in the public interest because they don't meet these three criteria. Because one company, if it has control of the whole market, there's no competition, it's very difficult for new competitors to enter the market, and therefore there's really no driver to force that monopoly to improve the way it does things. So in the UK, how do we regulate competition? Well, we have the Competition Act, first of all, which affects certain business practices. And then we also have controls on monopolies and mergers to try and monitor how businesses are merging, whether there are any big monopolies are developing, whether oligopolies are developing, to try and, if possible, to fragment the industry as much as possible, for the reasons we just mentioned. So let's have a look at the Competition Act. Now, the Competition Act comes from EU law, and basically it applies to all businesses. It doesn't matter whether it's a company or just a sole trader, you would be governed by the Competition Act. And if you breach the Competition Act, the penalty, 10% of worldwide profits. Make sure you know that, because that does get tested. So let's have a look at two key provisions in the Competition Act. The first one is about collusive behaviour. Now, what we're looking at there is we're looking at where businesses sort of work together to try and sort of keep prices at a certain level or to carve up the markets. So although there are a number of companies in a particular market, they aren't necessarily competing with each other in the way that we would like them to. Now, collusive behaviour can be tacit, or it can be something a bit more formal. If it becomes a bit more formal, we tend to refer to it as a cartel. Okay? Now, collusive behaviour or cartels, that's dealt with in Chapter 1 of the legislation. The other thing that legislation deals with, surprisingly in Chapter 2, is abuse of a dominant position. And we'll look at that in more detail in a moment, but just broadly, it's where one company decides that it has a bigger share of the market than its competitors, and it uses that, if you like, to bully its competitors, to stop them from getting new clients, to stop them from winning new customers. Okay, so let's start with collusion then. So what is collusion? Well, to say it covers formal and informal agreements, and it refers to where businesses try to basically do anything that distorts competition. And the best way to think about this is to look at the various examples. Fixing purchase or selling prices or other conditions, but let's think about that. How would businesses agree to fix the purchase price? Well, let's imagine all the supermarkets get together and they decide that they are not going to pay more than 70 pence for a litre of milk. Okay, if they all agree that, then the poor old milk suppliers, they've got no choice. They can't go somewhere else and sell their milk to them because all the main purchasers have agreed that they're only going to pay 70 pence. So therefore, the supermarkets are working together to distort the free market. Similarly, you could do the same thing with selling prices. The supermarkets could agree informally that they will only sell a litre of milk for £1 to all its customers. Now again, that means there's no competition going on in that milk market. So in both those circumstances, the market has been distorted. They might try and limit production or technical development. You know, we won't invest in developing new software this year if you don't either. Okay, any sort of agreement like that, which again limits that innovation in the market. Another one is sharing markets. Now, this is where businesses might agree, for instance, that they won't compete in certain areas. So you can have all the ACCA clients in Reading, and we will have all the CIMA clients in Reading. That could be an agreement between, say, First Intuition Reading and BPP Reading. That way, we're not competing on the same turf. We've decided to carve that market up. Now, we might also find in situations like that, you might see something called bid rigging. And bid rigging is where the businesses have agreed to divide a market up, or they've agreed that perhaps they'll take turns winning a contract. Therefore, they agree each time a major contract comes up, who will bid for it and what price they should bid, so that they can make sure that that company, the right company, is awarded the bid in each case. Now, the next 2 points can be much more difficult to detect, and they're to do with the terms on which businesses do transactions. So perhaps discriminating against certain parties by giving them different trading conditions. Now, in order for the Competition Act to come into play, the agreement must have what we call an appreciable effect on competition. So the Office of Fair Trading, who enforce the Competition Act, are incredibly busy. They're only interested in pretty big cases because they just don't have the resources to do anything else. But the legislation says that it must have an appreciable effect on competition. So we're looking at the relative market shares, we're looking at the effect on consumers, and how big those businesses are, how big players are they. Now, just to mention there about cartels, this is just another form of collusive behaviour, okay? And could be where we have an agreement not to compete, could be where we have a price fixing agreement, again, terms of the contract and bid rigging. Now, in addition to that 10% penalty, if you're a member of a cartel, there could be criminal sanctions as well. And those sanctions are brought under the Enterprise Act. Now, an example where that recently came up, well, not that recently now, but was between BA and Virgin, and they had actually agreed to enforce a certain surcharge on their flights, a certain fuel supplement. And it was Virgin who actually reported BA to the Office of Fair Trading for this particular cartel. And as a result of that, Virgin were granted immunity, whilst BA incurred huge financial penalties. Now, the examiner will expect you to understand what sort of circumstances give rise to collusive behaviour. You will see questions from time to time on this. So, where do they happen? Well, more likely to occur where there's a few competitors. The more competitors, the harder it is to get agreement. Also, where the products are similar. The more similar the products are, the less competition there is, the less you can differentiate between the different products, and therefore the more effective any sort of cartel agreement. So things like utilities, where one unit of electricity is very much like another. Flights, where the flight is probably pretty similar, give or take, between the major airline companies. Or goods which are homogeneous. Where there are open communication channels between competitors. Times of recession. When times are hard, people will resort to things like bid rigging and price fixing to try and maintain their profit margins. And then this extra point here, where there is excess capacity, I'd say that's probably a pretty important one in terms of your exam, something the examiner will expect you to know. Because if the industry has excess capacity, it means the competitors are competing over probably a relatively small market, possibly even a dwindling market. Therefore, they're trying to retain their price margins as long as they can, artificially perhaps, because demand and supply should mean that prices will fall if there's excess capacity. Okay, so prohibiting the abuse of a dominant position. Well, I've already said this is a bit like a big company bullying another company. And if we look there, to be dominant in a market, a business needs to have a good market share, usually 40% of the market. Now, whether or not a business can be dominant will also depend on how many competitors there are. If it's one big player and then other small competitors, then it's more likely to be dominant. But if there's 3 or 4 relatively decent-sized companies, then less likely to be dominated by any one company. Also, are there barriers to entry? Is it possible for new competitors to enter the market? Because a dominant company can make that very, very difficult by tying up suppliers, maybe of the key raw materials, maybe dominating the supply chain so that new entrants don't have chance to access the market. And again, we've got some examples there. What might be abuse of a dominant position? Imposing unfair purchase or selling prices, limiting production, changing trade conditions. Very similar, really, to the points that we saw when we were looking at collusion. And the examiner will expect you to be able to identify the difference between Chapter 1, collusion, and Chapter 2, dominant position. Quite often there is an overlap, but in the exam, try and look for keywords. If there are 2 businesses who are cooperating together, they're more likely to be colluding. If it's one company, it's more likely to be abuse of a dominant position. Okay. Now, as I've already said, these rules are enforced primarily by the Office of Fair Trading, and they can investigate businesses and impose certain penalties. So we've got there particularly that 10% of worldwide revenue. They can enter premises, they can seize documents. Publicity is a pretty big one as well. The Office of Fair Trading publishes the details of an investigation that is going to be damaging for a business. And if you remember from your law module, directors may be disqualified from acting as a company director under the CDDA, Company Directors Disqualification Act. And an investigation by the Office of Fair Trading could be grounds for disqualification for an order to be made. So implications for the individuals involved as well. Now, the Competition Commission, what do? Well, they look into mergers, takeovers, and regulators of markets. So their job is to try and make sure that one market isn't becoming dominated by one key player. Now, they don't look at public interest. Okay, the examiner will sometimes try and make you think that they do. That's not their role. Their role is purely to focus on competition. Okay, their job is to increase competition. Now, the Takeover Code is a set of rules. It's non-statutory, and it's meant to set out the principles and rules to deal with a takeover or a merger. Okay, and the idea is it's to make sure that takeovers and merger don't undermine competition in the UK. And there is something called a takeover panel who enforces that. I think, again, for the exam, you just need to be aware that that takeover code is there and that it's non-statutory.